Welcome to The Point with Mick Rich. I've got my good buddy here, Paul Gessing, with the Rio Grande Foundation. God, you and I sat down, what was it, a few years ago when I was thinking about running for office, but also the first time that I actually got to, I'm not going to say meet you, but my daughter and I went to the Martin Heinrich's town hall meeting to talk about the passage of the Affordable Care Act. And if I remember, I look back on that, it was Martin Heinrich was hosting, Dr. Richards, who is now, I think, president of the hospital, am I right? And then it was you, and then there was a doctor, I can't remember his name.
Vigil, I believe.
Right, and he had a nonprofit health clinic, nonprofit, no-cost health clinic, and I was in the audience with my daughter. It was interesting. My daughter was looking to get into healthcare. She is. She's was a PA. Now she's graduating from med school. So I thought we'd start off in this segment, Paul, is talking about healthcare, and we're talking about the COVID crisis. But really, what we're talking about here is a healthcare crisis.
Right.
That is what it is. Healthcare should have been well prepared for the crisis that we're facing today. I mean, the answer comes up as, how do you, is your doctor doing a great job for you? Yeah. What do you like about him? Well, I never see him. Well, the same thing goes true for our healthcare. If you, I don't know if you agree or not, but the idea is the healthcare's got to be there when we need it. And here it is, we have a healthcare system, we need it, and it's not there. So I wanted to talk to you about, back then on the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, it was you can keep your doctor, you can keep your health plan, costs are going to go down, and then as Yogi Berra would say, here we are today, and the promises, promises made. I didn't keep my doctor, I didn't keep my plan, the costs went up, and then now we are. Paul, you were there at the stage. The reason I bring it up. There you are, you're waving the lantern back and forth saying, look out, this isn't going to work for you. And here we are. We've got the Affordable Care Act. Is it working well for us?
Well, I think that's self-explanatory. We just came off of a presidential campaign here where President Biden and many of the Democrats in the primary, when they were competing against each other, overwhelmingly, they were all saying Obamacare isn't working, it's not getting the job done, we have to do X, Y, and Z, Medicare for all, we have to do all kinds of additional programs to solve the issues that Obamacare put on top of our existing system.
Right, so really what they're saying is, if I go back, it was the Affordable Care Act is taking your policy in mind and scrapping it for central planning.
Right.
What we're hearing is the problem that we had with their central planning was it wasn't central enough, right?
That's right. I had for example, just to reinforce your point, Rio Grande Foundation is a small nonprofit organization. We don't have a fancy corporate healthcare system, but I'm not on government insurance either. And when Obamacare came along, we had a health savings account system. Health savings account is in many ways the way a free market person would advocate healthcare works. It's a account, pre-tax money that's put in there. You pay a little bit on a monthly basis, pretty low for a very, if you get hit by a bus, a minimal healthcare system. And then a health savings account pays for your day-to-day expenses. It's the way we deal with our cars. We don't expect insurance to pay for oil changes. We shouldn't.
But today we're looking at this, and is it? I guess the answer is it working? I read in the newspaper is we need to start rationing care, right? Because the system's overwhelmed, and this is a system that they put into place. I mean, this is their system. It's not my system, not your system.
No.
It's their system. So first question I have is, it's not working. So what is working?
Well, so I do want to differentiate slightly. I mean, healthcare systems all over the world have been overburdened to an extent through the COVID-19 situation, and that's a problem. And I think a market-based system would do better than what we have. And it's worth noting also that New Mexico is very much a government-oriented state in general. People know intuitively that we're very reliant on federal dollars coming in here. That's not just the labs and the federal lands that we have, it's also systems like Medicaid and Medicare, which dominate in our healthcare system. So New Mexico is on the cutting edge of being reliant on these government programs.
Well,
and
they
obviously,
are reliant on, I mean, really, when we look at it and go across the board, we're dependent on these government systems, and we have our governor now saying we need to start rationing health care. I mean, when we talk about and we look at health care, because when I was going to college and I was taking, calculus, and they were talking about analyzing things from 0 to infinity, I'm looking at this with the COVID-19. This takes us to infinity. This situation, the system should work in that. Any system, and what amazes me is the people that put the Affordable Care Act into place aren't taking responsible and saying, here we are, we're starting to ration systems, rationing healthcare. We need to go back and look at more government control. How's that working for the folks there in the Navajo Reservation?
No.
It's a mess, right? They are in the worst shape of anybody in the country. And we're saying, so I'm looking at this and I'm saying, where do we go for, then we say, where's the saving grace in this crisis? And it's we're saying the vaccine.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that completely. The vaccine and its development has been a free market miracle, while so many aspects of our healthcare system are deeply embedded with government, reliant on government resources, federal, state, combinations of both. Vaccines typically take, I understand, 7 or so years to develop. In the case of the Trump administration, knowing this was a national emergency, they took a lot of the other barriers and problems that would be associated with developing a vaccine and did it. We're here in record time. The whole crisis started 9 months ago, really, in the United States. So it's been a miracle.
So really, what I see where the saving grace in the healthcare, we need to wrap it up, is it is private enterprise developing the vaccine, not big government developing the vaccine. This is when we talk about healthcare and where the lessons learned, it's about free enterprise. Welcome back. I've got my good buddy here, Paul, with me. And today we want to talk, this segment, talk a little bit about the New Mexico film industry, but at the same time, talk about the New Mexico oil and gas industry. And the reason I think it is important to talk about the two together is that the state is really focused on the film industry and saying this is our future, and then they're doing everything they can to push down to oil and gas. And Paul, you've got some pretty strong feelings about the film industry here in our state.
Well, I have no problem with the film industry here in our state. In fact, before subsidies were really a thing, New Mexico was involved in making some great movies, including the original Red Dawn, which was made in Las Vegas, New Mexico.
Oh, that's right, it was, wasn't it?
Milagro Beanfield War, which was a Robert Redford movie. Those are two of the big ones. Of course, the one where they drive the motorcycles across the country and come to New Mexico.
Easy Rider.
Easy Rider, that one is another one, escaped my mind. But when New Mexico got involved in the subsidization of Hollywood filmmaking in New Mexico, that really was a problem. It's always been a problem. It's ironic that it went back to the Johnson administration. Of course, we think of Gary Johnson as Mr. Libertarian, but he got us involved in the film subsidy business at 10%. So 10% of the filming costs that they spent here would be reimbursed to them.
Right.
Richardson upped that to 25%. It was unlimited, so Susana Martinez capped it at $50 million annually that could be spent.
Right.
And then in 2019, Michelle Lujan Grisham in the legislature completely blew the doors off the whole thing and have subsidy programs up to 35% of expenses being reimbursed. In the Netflix case, we have something called LEDA, which is Local Economic Development Act. It's another incentive program. The state cuts checks to businesses. We're going to spend another $24 million on that. And industrial revenue bonds, there's more. It's a lot of money going out the door. Industrial revenue bonds essentially allow businesses to avoid paying property taxes here in New Mexico, and they're considering a 20-year, what's called IRB for Netflix.
So out of
it's a lot of money.
curiosity, so what I'm hearing you tell me, so I just trying to, not trying to put words in your mouth, we're chumps. I mean, when we're talking about this, New Mexicans are chumps because we're not the ones, you know, feeding at the trough. I'm just saying, why not me? I mean, really, my company doesn't get those subsidies. I've been a responsible employer for over 30 years. I have put money back into our economy, and I'm not getting a 30% back or 35%. I'm paying, believe it or not, you believe it, I'm paying property taxes, high property taxes on my business property where my business is at. New Mexicans are chumps. I mean, what I'm hearing is that Hollywood's looking at it. And do you remember the movie with Robert Redford, and it was The Sting? Yeah. This is what's going on. I mean, these guys in Hollywood are coming out here and playing us for big bucks.
Yeah, I guess it's not average New Mexicans because you're not a chump, I'm not a chump. We are paying the taxes for this, and I would say that more interestingly, oil and gas is really paying the bills.
So they're
for
the
Hollywood.
chumps, right?
They're
so thank goodness. So Paul, thank goodness that we're not the chumps. It's oil and gas, and so let's talk about oil and gas.
Yeah.
What I'm seeing is at the state level, they're doing everything they can to squash oil and gas.
Well,
is that fair?
I wouldn't say we've seen that yet. So first and foremost, it's worth noting that in recent fiscal years, oil and gas picked up the tab for about 40% of New Mexico government. So when I say they're the chumps, they are paying full freight for a lot of what happens in this state, not just film subsidies. Will that hold true this year? After COVID, after oil and gas production has declined rapidly, it won't be quite as much, but it's still going to be a significant.
So they're not going to be as big a chump as they have been in the past.
Probably, and that's what concerns me about the future of the film industry. The two tracks, the one is the unlimited and ongoing, because Netflix signed a 10-year deal. So they'll be here 10 years at least getting checks from the state of New Mexico. Right. And where does that money come from? Because obviously oil and gas, who knows what's going to happen with their future. So then you're talking about other areas of government that Hollywood is taking money out of.
But when we talk about the legislature, I read about it, every legislative session's coming up, they're talking about new regulations on the oil and gas industry. We have more counties saying not here, like Mora, I was up there, no fracking here. I'm looking at our state land commissioner who's saying not here, not on our lands. Am I right?
I would say that she has been nuanced in her approach. She is trying to address some of the polluters that she sees, and I don't have all the details on that. I think the biggest threat to New Mexico's oil and gas is actually from Washington and the Biden administration, because so much of what we do oil and gas-wise is on federal lands, predominantly Bureau of Land Management. You know, people think federal lands are automatically these pristine, beautiful areas. BLM lands are not where a lot of recreation happens. Some does, but BLM lands are fairly industrial, multi-purpose, and oil and gas fits right in that. But Joe Biden campaigned on a federal ban on a process called fracking, which is basically how all oil and gas happens in our state. It involves the fracking process. So if he bans oil and gas fracking on federal lands, that is the #1 problem facing our state in the near future.
But if we look at oil and gas, if I go back and I think about to the Martinez administration, when Susana Martinez was governor, we had Barack Obama president.
Right.
And the saving grace was at least that we've got state lands, so we're able to really rock and roll in, while the Obama administration is putting the thumb down on oil and gas. Now it's flipped.
Right.
Now all of a sudden we're going to have the state at the same time as the feds. So when the question that I have is, what I think is ironic is we take the film industry, overall the people in the oil or the film industry are anti-oil and gas.
Yeah.
And the biggest subsidies, the people that are paying the subsidies are the oil and gas industry.
Right.
I mean, to be honest, you hit it on the, nail on the head, or hammer on the head, or whatever we want to call it. But what we're talking about here is the fact is that we're putting the screws to oil and gas, trying to open it up to the film industry. And, there isn't enough money
Right.
to keep bankrolling the film industry. And at the same time, I see the film industry cut. The only jobs that are really, when we look at the film industry, is in communities across our state, is the theaters. And now the film industry is cutting loose those guys.
Yeah.
I don't hear Robert Redford saying, or the top people that in the film industry saying, I'm going to give part of my salary to the young men and women that are taking tickets and handing out popcorn and drinks.
Yeah, I don't know if the film industry will ever recover in terms of the distribution aspect. Movie theaters, we may look at 10 years down the road like it's some kind of black and white picture, like your kids and my kids look at a drive-in theater. Now, ironically, drive-in theaters have come back a little bit in this recent situation, but you can't go to a drive-in movie nowadays here in middle of December or January or whenever. It's not in New Mexico, maybe out in California. So you've still got to have movie theaters, and those are a lot of jobs. They're not the highest paying jobs, but a lot of kids get their start in those businesses. The whole distribution model for Hollywood is changing dramatically. And the streaming seems to be the way it's going, which I enjoy. I have a Netflix account, Disney Plus, all those kinds of things. But the difference between today and what is being done to distribute those movies and what was done even 5 years ago, it's incredibly transformative. And it's I'm going to miss going to movie theaters if they don't come back.
Right. So what we're looking at here, we've got the leadership in Santa Fe saying our future's in the New Mexico film industry. And then you and I were all looking at it and saying, where's oil and gas? That the future isn't bright for New Mexico oil and gas. And I'm saying, if the only one that we're really pushing is heavily subsidized, this is like a perpetual motion machine. They don't exist.
Right. Yeah, we need the money from somewhere to pay the bills from Hollywood, because Hollywood is ultimately not a revenue generator for the state of New Mexico. It is a revenue, it's a user. It eats those revenues up. And the problem, and there's issues with oil and gas, but one of the biggest problems is that the money kind of flows in with very little actually being done, whether it's by the politicians or other people to generate it. Yes, it's great when the entrepreneurs go out and do the drilling and find the new assets, but they have to, there's not a lot of involvement from citizens in New Mexico to make sure those dollars flow here. It just flows based on market forces, what other states are doing and what the price is doing.
As we wrap this segment up, just to summarize, what it looks like to me is the short-sightedness of Santa Fe. They're looking at the next election cycle. They're not looking at the hardworking taxpayers of New Mexico. And I tell you what, looks tough for, as Joe Biden said, it's going to be a cold, dark winter. I'm here today with my good buddy, Paul Gessing, with the Rio Grande Foundation. Paul, I want to talk a little bit about the criminal justice system. One of the things that I see is that right now, Albuquerque is in the top 10 worst cities for crime, and at the same time, we've got federal oversight due to police force, unnecessary force, am I right? That's kind of what's going on. I would expect that those two things wouldn't happen in the same environment, that you would have the heavy-handedness of the police force putting the thumb on criminals, but we don't have that. It's kind of like going back to Jimmy Carter's days, where we had rampant inflation and rampant high unemployment and high interest rates. I'm going at this. I said, how in the world did we get here? And it amazes me. And so, Paul, you're in the Rio. You've got the Rio Grande Foundation, and the first question I have is, it wouldn't surprise me, and I think we're starting to see it, is vigilante justice.
Well, I know that gun sales are off the charts, and that is the prelude, I think, to that kind of thing. Personally, I have been fine in my neighborhood. It's not a super duper high-end gated neighborhood or anything like that. We haven't experienced a lot of those issues. But there's no doubt that Albuquerque has high crime rates and challenges with dealing with that. The police force, I guess, they haven't been able to get from under this DOJ memo in that situation, and that's the main concern. Obviously, it was troubling to get into that situation, but why can't we get out of it?
Well, I hear what you're saying about crime. For me, it's my guys went to the shop to pick up a couple equipment trailers, and then they started calling around, who's got the equipment trailers, and realized that wasn't our lock on our gate, on the side gate, and we lost two of our equipment trailers. We're working on a construction site over at 98th and Blue Water. The guys show up, and the generator's gone. And so here we have 30 people on the payroll and no electricity. I mean, the generator costs a few grand, but those guys working, say $50 an hour, you got 500, that time adds up pretty quick.
And that's one of many reasons that our business outlook is not as good as it could be, because businesses like yours have to pay those additional costs. They have to deal with the crime issue. Nobody wants to deal with that. And we should, as a city government, as a state government, be all in and focused on this. I drive around the streets of downtown Albuquerque. It's deserted except for the homeless largely. Other streets, 2nd Street, 3rd Street, 4th Street, coming in from the interstate, I-40, into downtown Albuquerque, it looks nothing short of a third world country.
It's awful. I come down here, it's awful. So we're in this mess. How did we get here? I'm looking, the first thing that comes to mind is, the first one is that we changed the bail bond regs. So we said bail bonds, men or women or bad folks, we need to keep the criminals away from them, protect the criminals from the bail bondsmen. And so that was one. Is that about right?
It's part of it. There's no one thing that's caused our crime issue to spiral out of control, except for the political leadership has not been there to crack down. And Mayor Marty Chavez got us into this mess with the police force and the DOJ. But most people in Albuquerque who have lived here long enough recognize that at that time, that administration was more serious than either of the two successors, R.J. Berry or Kim Keller.
I agree with that. The other one is that right now, I'm seeing that the police department is overwhelmed, and they're saying, we're just not going to take any reports, right? If it's $1,000 or less. And I go back to that gentleman that was getting on the bus, what was it, on Central? He had a bicycle, and a guy came up and to steal it, take it. It wasn't that the bike was sitting over here. It was the guy was holding his own bike, and this guy's wrestling the bike from him, and he's holding onto his bike. The guy pulls out a gun and shoots him. Well, guess what? The regs and the rules that were governed, that our mayor and everybody is working with, they're saying that's not a reportable crime because that bike's under $1,000. Somebody died over it. So we've got an issue with, we're saying we're not going to prosecute these crimes. We're not going to prosecute the criminals. We've got a bail bond system, a system where they get in, they get out, they're back on the street. There's no penalty for theft. And it gets back to that, we talked about the chump factor, right? The people in New Mexico, if you're obeying the laws in our city, you're a chump because the people that aren't being held accountable. I mean, Paul, this is what, so how do we get out? Paul, you're a bright guy, you're in the Rio Grande Foundation. There's 3 things that you say we got to do to turn the crime around. What are the 3 things?
Well, we need to elect politicians who are serious about addressing the crime issue. And there are innovative solutions even within this DOJ purview to do that, whether it's more jail beds, putting them through criminal justice system. And it's not just the mayor, it's also the judges that we elect.
That's right.
And making sure that they're serious about the crime issue. But ultimately in a democracy or a democratic republic like we live in, the political leaders respond or fail to respond based on the pressures that they are dealt with. And until the people either are marching in the streets or voting differently, the situation is going to continue as it is. And I hope that we see pressure build as we head towards municipal election in the next year, and just generally are making decisions about the direction of our city, because it seems that there's too much strong public support. So I would say that's number 1 with a bullet, and everything else is kind of secondary to that.
I get that. I understand what you're saying here. But when I'm talking to the average man or woman on the street, and we're just talking about what's going on. Let's say I'm going to run for office, and I say, this is what I'm going to do to turn crime around.
Right.
Okay? So first item is what?
Put the bad guys in jail.
We're going to put the bad guy, right.
Yeah.
So if you break the law, I don't care whether it's $50 or $1,000 or 10,000, you're going to get arrested. Yeah. And we're going to follow through and put you in jail.
And that's what studies show is most effective. I mean, it's not just me saying that. If you do something and there's a credible threat that you're going to be caught and prosecuted and stuck in jail for that crime, whatever it is, but commensurate with the crime and how serious it is, that is the only way. Because right now, and in general, criminals think they can get away with things, and by and large, they're right.
So here's what story is. I'm driving down the road. I look over and there's my truck. My truck had been stolen 6 months earlier.
Wow.
So I followed it. They finally gave up and pulled over. And I got them to, they just walked away from the truck. And
you're lucky. It could have been much more confrontational.
But it was confrontational. But they walked away from the truck. And so the police showed up. And they're going through their belongings. They were moving. And they said, do you recognize anybody here? And I said, yeah, it looks like, that looks like that's the groomsman was driving the truck. And then they go, what about this guy? I said, looks like she's put on weight since high school. It was her high school, yearbook. And they knew who it was. They never prosecuted him.
Right.
And so that's number 1. So we're going to catch the criminals. We're going to prosecute the criminals. And when we talk about prosecuting, we're going to have prosecutors that are committed to prosecute these individuals. And then lastly, when I go to vote on the judges, I'm looking at, I don't see a real scorecard with these are the cases that they let criminals free. I don't see any. I'm going there and I say, which judge was it that let that person out that went and killed people?
Right.
And I don't see that, a scorecard. So we need a scorecard on what judges are doing what. And then lastly, we need enough spaces so these individuals are off the street. As we close this segment, I want to bring a point up to you that when we talk about the federal oversight, And I really think it comes down to a point of view that changed probably 20, 30 years ago. We went from peace officers to police officers. That the only time we see a policeman or woman is when something's gone south. That we need to get back to that idea of peace officers, that they're part of the community, not separate.
Yeah, those are all good policies that could be worked right here in New Mexico. We've seen other cities. In New York in the 60s and 70s was a pretty lawless place, and that changed big time by the mid-'80s. And it took some fortitude, it took someone willing to stick their neck out and be politically unpopular and make tough decisions. And there's no reason we can't have that kind of success here in Albuquerque. But it's first and foremost, it requires the citizens to stand up, elect different people, or make sure that the people they do elect, of whoever they are really serious about crime. I don't think we've seen that so far, not just with the current administration, but prior.
And guess what? I agree with that 100%. Welcome back. I've got my good buddy here, Paul Gessing with the Rio Grande Foundation. And we've been talking about this whole idea of individual empowerment, making a difference in people's lives, the failure of central government planning, whether it's just in Santa Fe or whether it's in Washington. In this last segment, Paul, I want to talk about, we have a legislative session. I guess it's interesting. It's going to be in a roundhouse. I always think about going to see the Barnum and Bailey circus. It was always in a round tent, right? Yeah. And that's what we've got up in Santa Fe. But again, they're going to be going through the priorities. And one of the things that I've thought about is that when they enact legislation, there's two sets of legislation to make sure that the state is taking care of those basic needs and responsibility of federal government. That's number one. And then number two is addressing the crises that our state's facing. If we look at it, we have been at the bottom 10 of the states in the country for what, 10 years, 20 years? For a long time. Yeah. And I'm thinking is, what's the priority? The priority should be to get New Mexico from the bottom 10 to the top 10 and do it in 10 years. And they come up with legislation and they look at it and they say, you know what, if it doesn't hit that criteria, we're not doing it. Like the Rail Runner. Did the Rail Runner make a difference to get us to move us from the bottom 10 to the top 10? Did the spaceport move us from the top, the bottom 10 to the top 10? We're stuck in the we're stuck in the mud, and we've been doing it. We go to Santa Fe, and they're over there. They're bickering about one another. They're looking at different issues. We're dying on the vine. People are leaving the state. They're frustrated. Paul, if you could say 5 things, okay, there's 5 things that you say we need for the first year in a 10-year plan.
Oh, wow.
The first year in a 10-year plan.
Right.
And you're going to say, what's the 5 key focus that we're going to do in 2021 to start to get us out of the mud?
Well, first and foremost, the legislature starts up in mid-January. We don't actually know if the big house, the big tent, the big house I almost said, but that building in Santa Fe will be hosting all of our legislative session. And I think transparency is critical for that in real terms, because a 60-day session is so much different from a special session. And not having the public involved would be really problematic. I can't emphasize that enough. Again, this gets down to, is the public going to demand their seat at the table, or are they just going to go quietly and allow these folks to meet behind relatively closed doors? Yes, Zoom is wonderful, but it's not a way to have a legislative meeting.
Paul, I just want to share with our viewers that I went up there for a hearing one time, and it was close. And what you don't catch and understand from a Zoom meeting is that it was a close vote, and the Democratic leaders went over and had you could see the two individuals chatting over here. Then they go over and talk to the one Democrat legislator, rep. And then you could see that he wasn't swayed yet. And then you saw him, and they go, you, over here. And they take him in the back room.
Yeah.
And then you don't see that in a Zoom meeting.
No.
Most of the New Mexicans don't see what goes on. So much goes behind closed doors. So the first item is, you're going to say, this first thing is transparency.
That is the first thing, yeah. And that's because we have such a concern about whether that'll happen. We've had 2 special sessions on Zoom. I just don't think you can do that in a 60-day session.
So number 2.
Number 2, gross receipts tax reform. This doesn't necessarily need to cost the state any money, but we need to reform the system in ways that don't hit small businesses in other sector employers that don't, if you're not an employee of someone, you're a contractor, you provide a good or service, suddenly you have to charge 7 or 8% in most areas, and that is not a good thing to make New Mexico uncompetitive on, because so much more of our economy is the gig economy. It's these short-term gigs.
That item, what I hear is that our tax structure puts us in a position to be at the bottom, that we need to revise our tax structure, and beginning with gross receipts tax.
Gross
I'm not trying to
tax is number 1, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
There's other things we could do, but
but
it's 1 and 1A is gross receipts
So
tax.
that's the first year.
Yep.
Number 3.
Well, we have school choice or broad-based school reform, education system. I mean, we could go for an entire hour just on the issues facing our children because of the shutdown and the coronavirus, but we also know that New Mexico's education system has not been getting the job done for a long time. And we need to empower parents and families to look at options and work to increase the competency and efficiency of our education system through some competition. I know that sounds like you're taking the private sector free market and putting it into education, but a monopoly run by the government is not necessarily what you look at to say, we're going to do something really efficiently and well.
So last year I had some interns that I was working, that we were all working together. And they came up with an interesting idea. And it had to do with teacher evaluations. They said, why are we only evaluating the teachers? Teachers hate teacher evaluation.
Sure.
Why? Because the problems aren't just the teacher.
Right.
It's the whole, but the school systems and the state doesn't want parents and children to evaluate the schools and the system and the state. They want to limit. So one of the things to do is day one is say, we're going to change the evaluation process. We're going to evaluate the teachers, the school, the district, and the state. And I think school choice, I agree with that 100%. Okay, that's number 3. 4.
Well, this is probably near and dear to your heart, which is right to work and repeal our Davis-Bacon law, which right to work simply means that you don't have to join a union as a precondition of employment. Nowadays, it's relegated to just the private sector.
Right.
We had a Supreme Court ruling in Janus versus ASME that allowed government employees to choose whether they want to be a part of a union or not. Private sector workers should be given that right as well. They're not in New Mexico. And the other one is Davis-Bacon. That's prevailing wage law. That's on government public works projects. You automatically increase here in New Mexico the cost of those projects by 10–15% in many cases.
Do you know how the Davis-Bacon got started?
It was a federal issue back when large numbers of African Americans were coming from the South and taking the jobs of white workers. This is, of course, during the Jim Crow era. And so the political establishment at the federal level decided that they wanted to protect those workers
That's
from
right.
competition, and so they essentially handed over pricing of public works projects to the unions
And it froze out the minorities, specifically to Americans of African descent.
yes.
So is that 5? Do you have one more?
Oh, well, the other one is occupational licensure. We always are working to make it easier for people to get involved in work, and there's no reason that people cutting hair, not that you or I necessarily have great need of these people, but you shouldn't have to go through
I agree with that.
all this licensing and paying fees to the government just for the privilege of cutting hair, and that's one of many
Guess
industries.
what? And I
in the
agree
state.
with that 100%. And Paul, we need to wrap this up, but I appreciate, man, good seeing you again.
Good seeing you, yeah.
That's one. Number 2 is that always appreciate what you have to say. You've got a great ideas and thoughts on how to make a difference in our state. And I appreciate the commitment you have to our state. And
Thanks. And for more information, go to riograndefoundation.org. You can also read our regularly updated blog, errorsoфenchantment.com, and we have a regular podcast, Tipping Point, New Mexico. So check all those out.
Good deal.
Thanks,
Paul,
Mick.
thank you very much. This is Mick Rich, and it's To The Point.